I got this. Oh, I didn't know. Oh, I forgot that you were. Yeah, this is serious. Wow, look how old that wood is. I know, let's go over here. Oh, it was like a heart attack.
Come on down, don't be bashful.
Took your hat off.
Okay. All right, flashlights out. All right, so all up and down the West Coast in the 1850s, people were talking about crimping. Crimping? What's crimping? Well, crimping actually meant the same thing as Shanghai. It's just that Shanghai didn't make it into the dictionary until about 1871. 21 years after the practice was first invented and put to use here in Portland. That's because Portland was a jumping off point. Ships would pull in from Europe, throw off their load of ballast, take on a load of cargo, head right back out to sea. Time was money. Now the vast majority of the ships that pulled into port here, once they took on a load of cargo and headed back out to sea, first port of call, most of the time, Shanghai, China. So that's how it came to be nicknamed Shanghai. I mentioned it took place all up and down the West Coast, from Alaska down through the Olympic Peninsula, a little town known for its Victorian houses, Port Townsend, a little house, or a little, town known out here at the mouth of the Columbia River, Astoria, the Barbary Coast, now known as San Francisco, and as far south as San Pedro near Los Angeles. Now everywhere else, they waited for a sea captain to pull into port and place an order for men before they went out and kidnapped these guys. They went into places of vice, saloons, gambling dens, bordellos. The whole object was to remove them from the above ground into the underground as quickly as possible. So here in Portland, the ever-progressive city that we are, well, we had a why wait attitude. So we went out ahead of time, kidnapped these guys, threw them into holding cells in the underground, made them available to these sea captains 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. No other city was like this. That's why Portland had a saying in those days. There was always an able-bodied crew waiting for a needy sea captain. The thing about the underground you have to keep in mind is this. Change always has and always will negatively impact the underground in some manner. Anytime you see them working on the streets or the sidewalks, they'll dig up a tunnel, they'll backfill it with concrete. That's because these tunnels weren't designed to carry the weight of some of the equipment that we have out on the road these days. Eventually one of those tunnels will collapse under all that weight. Very expensive to get that piece of equipment out and repair it. So the city's very proactive about going out and backfilling these things anytime they run across them. So you really can't go from building to building anymore like you used to be able to, but not to worry. We have a good example of a tunnel. There's about 12 feet that goes under the sidewalk. Also, right next to it is a Shanghai tunnel that runs in between buildings. We're going to get to walk through that. So no worries, you will be able to go through a Shanghai tunnel. So the first thing that really negatively impacted the underground was almost 100 years ago. When they built the Tom McCall waterfront park that harbor wall, or sea wall as it's sometimes called. I was in the Navy for 4 years. They called them quay walls. They're simply a concrete wharf that ships can tie up to, but it also doubles as a form of flood control. I mentioned that the Willamette flooded quite a bit back in those days, and when it did, you could literally float a ship down some of the streets of Portland. So they built that harbor wall in 1925. Took them 3 years to complete. They had to tear down the entire waterfront to do this. Prior to that, the ground sloped from about 3rd Street all the way down to the water line. So when they finished that harbor wall, they had to bring in so much backfill. The businesses along the Ado Parkway, now known as, it used to be known as Front Avenue, it's now known as the Ado Parkway. They said that their first floors became their new basements, their second floors became their new first floor entrances. So it's kind of interesting if you're walking downtown McCall Waterfront Park, you're looking at these old buildings built prior to 1925. You're not looking at their original first floor entrances, you're looking at their modified second floor entrances. Now later on, in the late 1950s, early 60s, Portland was going through its first urban renewal program, the South Waterfront Urban Renewal Program. They were tearing down a lot of these old buildings, putting up new high-rises, so that severely impacted the underground. The 70s, the transit center went in, 80s, the light rail. But amazingly enough, the latest form of impact is earthquake proofing. We do have earthquake faults running through the Portland metro area. They run diagonally from the St. John's area to the northwest, from the northwest down through Portland and into the Molalla area to the southeast. So the city of Portland's very proactive about going out and retrofitting these old brick buildings. They don't want the same fate befalling Portland that happened to San Francisco in 1906. Now what happens when they earthquake-proof a building? Well, they put up steel reinforcing, and then they cover up all this beautiful brick and stone you see behind us here with dull gray concrete. Now 3 other sections of the underground that we're going into this evening have been impacted this way. And it's very time-consuming and expensive to come back and try and restore it to its original beauty. Well, you know, they say it could always be worse. Oh boy, it could always be a lot worse. It was almost 20 years ago when the contractor was down here doing the earthquake proofing. He called Michael up one day. He said, you know that room you guys just finished renovating? Well, he called it a room, but it's actually an opium den. One of the last ones that we know of here in Portland. He said, I'm sorry, I have to retrofit that wall behind it. I'm going to have to rip it out. Has to go. Michael was devastated, but he knew there was nothing he could do about it. Well, 3 days later, the contractor called him back and said, never mind. I don't have to rip that room out after all. Michael asked him why. He said, well, according to the city of Portland, it's outside the building. Outside the building? Well, that was news to us because we always thought this beautiful brick and stone wall was the outside of the building. You'd think so, wouldn't you? I did on my first tour, but it's not. It's actually this post. This is the official outside of the building. Well, now it starts to make a little bit more sense because in the early 1970s, Michael befriended an old Portland street cop that went by the name of Al Zarnato. And Al was an expert on the Chinese Tong gangs that ran these opium dens. He even spoke a little Mandarin Chinese himself. And he always told Michael, he said, you know, I never remembered coming down through a trap door in the back of Lazo Saloon, as hobos was known in those days, to raid this opium den the 3 to 5 times in his career that he did. He remembered coming down through a trap door in the back alley behind Lazo Saloon. So this is the gas line that feeds the gas fireplace that I pointed out to you in the back of Hobo's restaurant. If you recall, that part of Hobo's restaurant was all part of a dead-end back alley prior to the 1970s. Well, if it didn't make sense before, now it makes a heck of a lot more sense. When the cops raided this opium den, they come down through that trap door that we salvaged and put on display there, and they come down this stair ladder to raid this opium den. You can see where the original trap door was, where the floor joist is missing above that stair ladder. So the guys that bought that opium would have to rent one of these bunks over and above the price of the opium. That's because opium will make you nod out and go on opium dream of some kind. Same thing with heroin. But they had to rent one of these bunks. What do you think was more expensive, the top, middle, or bottom?
Bottom.
Middle.
You got a good cross section of guesses. So actually, it was the bottom. And why the bottom? Because the bottom was the least expensive, because if you fell out of bed, you didn't have as far to go. The higher you went, the cheaper it was. But I got that backwards. The bottom was the most expensive, because if you fell out of bed, you didn't have as far to go. The higher you went, the cheaper it was, but the bigger the headache. Unless, of course, the guy in the bottom fell out first and you landed on top of him. So this is a Victorian lampshade we dug out of the debris down here. Came out of the bordello in the hotel up above. This is a steamer trunk that we dug out of the garbage as well. And over here is the frame of a Chinese rickshaw. No wheels. The fabric's pretty much rotting away, but that is the frame of a Chinese rickshaw. Everybody knows what a Chinese rickshaw is, right? Yeah. If you don't, there's no shame in that. It's just a human-powered cab. It's like a little go-kart. Chinese guy would run around town for a cab fare, hauling 1 or 2 people in that thing. So this pot represents where the opium dealer would have kept his money and his opium in a little wooden barrel. Our archaeologist was doing a dig in here and had some volunteers helping him. We dug up the remnants of that little wooden barrel. The wood had pretty much rotted away, but we found the metal bands that held it together. So he closed that trap door, threw a rug over it. That was high-tech security for that time period. Much simpler days in that time period. So anyway, when the cops raided this opium den, the guys that were lucid enough, along with the opium dealer, would come rushing through this door, across this floor that actually never had so many people standing here before, and they go running right through this hole in the wall that actually never used to be here either. There used to be an open archway. You can see where the archway was originally, framework of that archway. A lot of the archways were bricked in the 1940s after Shanghai ended. Who wants to share their basements with their neighbors? Very easy to come in and steal your merchandise. Prior to that, the underground was the domain of the Shanghaiers and the white slavers. The merchants up above didn't dare store their goods down here. If they were caught wandering around in the underground, they could very easily be victimized themselves. So the contractor that was doing the earthquake proofing down here knocked that hole in the wall to access this section. When he found out he didn't have any work to do in here, he put that door on it with a lock to remind us we were not supposed to go through that hole in the wall. Well, guess what, folks? They're long gone. We don't listen too well. And you can bet we're going through that hole in the wall in just a few minutes. First, though, I want to explain why the cops never followed these guys through that brick archway. Because, for 2 reasons, Al Zarnato said the cops in those days weren't very well trained, they weren't very well paid, everybody was on the tape from the lowest beat cop all the way up to the mayor. So the cops were paid to raid these opium dens, flush these guys out, and they went running through that open archway into what they thought was relative safety. Key word being relative here, folks. They were actually running right into the arms of the Shanghaiers who were waiting on the other side of that archway. They called it harpooning. You didn't want to be harpooned because you weren't going anywhere real quick except straight into a holding cell and eventually out to sea as slave labor aboard a ship for the next 3 to 6 years. The cops wouldn't follow them as well because they saw these things strung out throughout the underground around these opium dens. They thought they were booby traps, but they're not. They're a very simple but effective warning device. The Shanghaiers were opportunists. They knew where every opportunity lay to grab a guy. Now, what's easier than a guy that's all doped up on opium? He can't fight back. So, Shanghaiers would sneak in here in the dark without lanterns. They'd raid these opium dens, haul these guys off to their section, throw them into a holding cell. They'd even take the opium dealers. So, the opium dealers got wise to this. The Chinese Tong gangs had strung these cans throughout their section of the underground around these opium dens. When these Shanghaiers snuck in here in the dark, They wouldn't see these cans, they'd run into them. That would let the opium dealer inside. Somebody was out here that didn't belong. He would bar the door, the Shanghaiers would go away empty-handed. Now, I don't know if you folks have watched the History Channel, Sci-Fi Channel, Travel Channel. I'm going to sneak back through the crowd here. If you've seen any of those programs, we've had them, all of those folks down here filming at one point or another. You might have seen an episode on a woman by the name of Nina. First, though, I want to explain that when people come down here, they'll take photographs of this opium den. When they get home, they'll download their photos onto their computer. They'll put those photos in their edit program. They'll try and lighten them up by playing around with the shadows, the brightness, the contrast. And when they do, they sometimes call us back and say they see the face of a woman in that window. So that's Nina. She was a member of the Klickitat tribe that inhabited the upper regions of the Columbia River in those days. One day, white slavers went upriver, raided her village, kidnapped her and some other women, brought them back downriver to Portland, and sold them into prostitution. So Nina was a prostitute in the Old North End in those days. Now, as I mentioned, we had a lot of cops down here in this part of town, very little law enforcement. So the missionaries arrived. They were trying to end all of the white slavery and the Shanghaiing that was taking place, but they weren't very successful. Now, they ended up befriending Nina. Now, she knew just how dangerous it could be to get close to these folks, but they promised her they'd gain her freedom, get her back to her people and her old way of life. So she eventually went out, gathered such detailed and extensive information that the missionaries very naively took it to the cops. They said, great, now we can clean up the Old North End. By the way, who provided such fantastic information? Well, once again, the missionaries dropped Nina's name very naively. That sealed her fate. 2 nights later, she was thrown down an elevator shaft to her death. And the reason that we see her face in that window to this day is because the elevator shaft was in the building behind that wall. Now, we've not only seen her down here, we've seen her up in the courtyard where we had the orientation. She's been spotted up in Hobo's restaurant and even out on 3rd Street. People will approach her and ask her if she is going to or from a costume party because of the lovely Victorian gown she is wearing. She will simply stop right in front of you, smile at you, turn around, walk away, disappearing as she goes without saying a word, because the last time she spoke, now that cost her her life. So take a good look in this opium den, a few photographs, then follow me through the hole in the wall, past the low beam.
It's turned off. It takes forever to. No, I want to blow it up.
I think there's a couple more.
Everybody as close to me as possible, please. Very good reason for it. Are you the last person through?
You want us to close the door?
No, that's all right. Are you the last person though?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Everybody over as close as possible. All righty. All right, so where we are standing, once stood 3 holding cells. Now you don't see them standing here today. Michael knows they were here because he saw them in the early 1970s. The reason they're not standing today is because the fire marshal decided to take a walk through the underground in 1974, saw them, ordered them ripped out as a fire hazard. Now, as some of you can probably see, a little easier to see from this side because the light's over here, but this is a fire sprinkler. There's a little sprinkler right here, and the whole system runs through here. The first fire sprinkler system installed in 1958. Also, we have very thick wooden floor joists. Original dimensional wood, not the trimmed down stuff you get these days, wooden floors. So a fire hazard? Not really. He later admitted to Michael after he retired that he was told on high at the city anything that reminded him of Shanghai or white slavery, he was to order it ripped out as a fire hazard. The city's very embarrassed by its past. It doesn't want you down here seeing and learning about all of this. Also, there's still a lot of families that wield a lot of influence with City Hall, whose ancestors made their fortunes on what was literally an underground economy at the time. So they don't want you down here seeing and learning about all of this either. They're very embarrassed by their ancestors' past. So any chance the city gets to erase its past, it will do so. But erase it, cover it up with concrete. You can't get rid of it because it's history, it actually happened, and it was passed down through the generations, so that's why this is truly an oral history. So, as I mentioned, this was where 3 holding cells stood, one right here, one over in that corner, and one over in the far corner. There was a window with bars on that wall. There was a window with bars over there. As you can see, so I don't blind anybody, that's a good example. Took out 3 to 5 guys at a time. Most saloons have at least 1 to 3. Places like Americans took up the entire city block. That had 12. The Valhalla had 10. Now, at its peak, between 1880 and 1910, they were able to record over 3,000 men a year missing out of Portland. That's just what they could record, probably a heck of a lot more. So at $50 a head in that day's money translates to about $2,500 to $3,000 in today's money. These guys were making some pretty serious cash, and like I said, they did spread it around. So, once you were standing at the right place at the right time, or the wrong place at the wrong time, depending on how you looked at it, the bartender would ring a buzzer or a bell, alerting the 2 guys stationed down below that they had a customer coming, and then he'd pull the lever. Then would come a poor guy like Matt. Matt's fallen through here so many times he's lost his head. So these things were on
a cushion.
Yeah, you landed on a mattress. So these things were on a counterweight system. The door would snap right back shut. That's a ring where the ropes went to the counterweight right over there. Here's the other ring where the rope went to the counterweight for this thing. So it'd snap right back shut. That's another way nobody ever noticed anything. Of course, you're good and drunk. Your back's to these things anyway. So this is where the original trap door was. You can see the newer wood. It was replaced in the early 1970s. So this thing would have been positioned further up. So that's how they operated. Take a good look, a few photographs, and follow me into the next section.
And then once you get thrown down,
Okay, folks, come on in.
If electricity drains the wire,
Yeah.
if you got metal on metal, it puts things out.
You did a job.
Okay.
Carbs.
Yeah. Okay, so get your attention. This is an authentic cigar store Indian, one of my favorite displays down here. It's a real work of art. You don't see them too much around here. I had some Canadians on my tour a few years ago. They said, well, we got a lot of these up there in Canada, you know. Well, we don't have them down here, so I'm pretty impressed by it. Pretty cool thing. It was carved here in the late 1800s. Stood in front of a cigar store here in Portland. A very interesting story behind this thing, and it involves our good friend Joseph Bunko Kelly once again. Guy had a pretty colorful career. Apparently it was a very nasty winter night. A bad storm had blown in off the Pacific. Icy cold rain just whipping through the streets of the old North End. Not too many guys out to Shanghai. And old Bunko was short a man for a sea captain. Bunko never failed to place an order for a sea captain. So he's out scouring the streets with his associates looking for an easy victim. Well, they go by the cigar store where this thing was on display. He stopped and he mentioned to his buddies, he said, geez, I wish this thing were real. But not because of how big he is, because of what he represents. Native American. Native Americans always brought a premium to these Shanghaiers. The sea captains really wanted them on board their ship because the Native Americans adapted to life at sea quite easily. They worked extremely hard and they never complained. So the sea captains were always willing to give up a little extra money for these Native Americans. Well, not one to pass up an opportunity. Old Bunko hatched a plan right there and then. Came back later that night with his associates. Had to have a crew of about 6 to 8 guys. This thing solid wood weighs 300 to 400 pounds. They wrapped a tarp around him, threw a rope around it, tied him up nice and tight, and that tarp hauled him down through the underground, out to the waterfront, and they sold him to a sea captain. Not for the going price of 50 bucks, not for 60, not even for 70. Old Bunko was quite the shyster. He managed to get 75 bucks out of that sea captain. A lot of haggling going on at first. Sea captain didn't want to pay that much money, so Bunko got frustrated, said, fine, I'll go down the wharf, I'll sell him to some other sea captain. In fact, I'll probably get as much as 85 bucks for this guy. Well, the sea captain finally said, no, I never had a Native American on board my ship this big before. So he finally gives Bunko the 75 bucks. Bunko tells the sea captain, whatever you do, don't let this guy wake up until you get out past the bar. If you do, he's going to rip your ship apart. Just leave him down in the forward hold, let him sleep off those opium drops. So the sea captain did just that. Waited till he got out past the Columbia bar and out to sea, couldn't wait any longer, ran down to the forward hold, went to shake the guy awake, lo and behold, stiff. He said, damn, the knockout drops killed another one. So we got him unwrapped, saw what he had paid so much money for. He got so angry, he had his crew haul it up to the deck and throw it overboard. It floated around at sea for a few days before it was picked up in a fisherman's net just outside of Astoria. They brought it back to town, back to Portland. Michael was able to obtain him a few years ago, put him on display down here. So the chief, he was a victim, but he's a survivor. He's one of the lucky ones that actually made it back. Now, did that sea captain, when he finally pulled back into port many years later, not buy any more guys from Bunko? Well, of course he did. But at least the next time he bought a crew of guys from Bunko, even though he might not know if those guys were dead or alive, at least this time he could be pretty darn sure they would be real human beings and not a wooden carving. So, that artist rendering that I pointed out to you of Bunko in the back of the white slave cell, that was an artist rendering done at his trial for murder many years later. Eventually, the Shanghaiers here in Portland decided they couldn't compete with him either, so they framed him for murder. He did 13 years in the state pen. When he got out, he wrote a book about how miserable conditions were in the state pen. Yeah, kind of amusing a guy like that writing a book of that nature. So, you'll follow me into the final section and we'll wrap this tour up.
I know, but it's just kind of.
Oh, hi, Bill. Sorry. I just stepped. Mommy, watch your step.
Careful pointing upward.
Okay, so once you all get in here, you get a chance to put your fingers through those bars. You're going to notice those bars are very uniquely shaped. They're shaped that way for a reason. That's because these guys were early day longshoremen, big beefy loggers, cowboys, sheep herders. They got their hands through those bars they could grab. What was ever on the other side? Probably be a Shanghaier. They wouldn't let go. So they had to design those bars so the guys couldn't get their hands through those and grab somebody on the other side. Well, we had a group of Chinese folks from mainland China that took our tour. Pretty large group of folks. They had 3 different interpreters because they spoke 3 different dialects. But all 3 groups agreed. Those very same bars reminded them of the ancient Chinese prisons back home. So the Chinese actually brought their technology to Portland, incorporated it into the underground. Those bars are cast in sand. You'll notice that they're trapezoidal shaped. They're not shaped like their normal jail bars that are round. So don't stick your fingers in too far. You might be spending the night down here. Okay, so this sign is an exact replica of one that hung in the lobby of the Hotel California when the missionaries had a sailor's mission set up in that lobby. They were trying to provide a safe harbor for these guys so they wouldn't be Shanghai. Again, they weren't very successful. While that mission existed, you'll notice this white wicker furniture that also came out of the lobby of the Hotel California. So the reason for that sign, the missionaries knew that these guys hadn't seen their families in years. Travel took a long time in those days. These guys were working their way across the Great Northwest, so they hadn't seen their families in a good number of years. If they got these guys to write back to their families, at least their loved ones would know where their lost sons were the last time they were seen alive. Now, while that did attract some attention to what was going on in the Old North End in those days, some families did come looking for their lost sons. Again, when everybody's paid off, nobody sees or hears anything, the families went away empty-handed. So while the mission did end up failing sometime afterwards, the Hotel California, that was the longest running, most notorious and successful house of prostitution here in Portland, that succeeded. It wasn't shut down until the early 1970s or 50s, the early 1950s, when Portland started enforcing its prostitution laws. So this is an area where we get a lot of paranormal activity. This is where we get reports of people seeing the shadows of folks going across the wall the most when there's nobody there. We had a paranormal group. A guy had a very expensive infrared camera positioned right about here. It was an industrial grade infrared camera. He had it pointed at that couch against that wooden wall. Now, they were picking up heat signatures of people sitting on that couch when there was nobody sitting on the couch. In fact, there wasn't anybody in this whole section at all. They were viewing that couch through a remote from the other side of the wall over by the cigar store Indian. Well, the cameraman's little girl was 12 years old. She thought it would be pretty cool to come in and sit down with the ghosts. When she did, those heat signatures disappeared. So they got her off the couch around the other side of the wall. They said, please, come back. Within 15 to 20 minutes, all of those heat signatures had returned. Again, nobody sitting on the couch, let alone in this section of the underground. So pretty interesting things happen in this part of the underground as well. So, as I mentioned, Frank Hammond remembered exactly which tunnel he was hauled out through. He wanted to show Michael that tunnel. Michael knew what it looked like because he'd been in it exploring as a kid. So Michael wanted to give Frank his due. In those days, Michael knew Bill Nieto, who made his fortune in real estate after he was released from the internment camps after World War II. He still has a good rapport with the Nieto family, so he went and got permission in the Keys to bring Frank into the underground so they could look at that tunnel. But when they got down there, they found out they were just a little bit too late. That whole wall had been earthquake-proof, covered up with steel reinforcing and dull grade concrete. Frank was pretty old in those days, crippled up. He walked with 2 canes. When he finally got to where that tunnel entrance once was, he dropped his canes to his side, put his hands on the wall. He slid down, turned around, put his hands in his face and started sobbing. Well, Michael thought he was having a medical event, like a heart attack or something. So he said, "Frank, what's wrong?" And Frank sobbed through his hands. "Now it's all gone. Nobody will ever believe my story." And Michael said, "No, Frank, we're going to be sure to tell your story." So while this can certainly be entertaining, we're not down here to sensationalize any of this. This is an educational and historic tour. The real reason we're down here is to tell you the stories of those victims of the Shanghaiers and the white slavers, those victims who are not able to be down here, and tell you their stories themselves, as incredible as some of them may sound. Sometimes real life is stranger than fiction, folks. So, if you haven't had a chance to put your fingers through the very same bars the Shanghai guys have put their fingers through, feel free to do so. We're going to head back to the opium den section for a quick debriefing before exiting the underground. So if you'll follow me.
I don't want to go to school
So creepy.
It's like you kind of want something to tug your finger or something.
Yeah. Or that. Yeah.
I don't think I'm going to be here by myself.
Puzzle will come together and large doors open for it. Be as detailed as possible. Take one of our flyers over there against the wall. Also, if anybody had a paranormal experience, you don't want to share it in front of your family or friends, you're a little embarrassed, no problem. Take one of our flyers and be as detailed as possible. We try to document everything that happens down here. We pass that information off to our paranormal investigators for a follow-up. Also, If you want to be a volunteer, found this interesting, want to come down and help out, we're always looking for volunteers. We'll take some of your free time off your hands. If you don't want to help out with the tours, we do have work parties, we do maintenance in the underground. We've acquired a new section over on 2nd Street that we're restoring right now. We do open it up for certain tours. It's kind of limited, but if you have any skills, we'll put those skills to use. We're still working on restoring that part of the underground. We do have a property up on the mountain in Mount Hood, at the base of Mount Hood, rhododendron, right off of Highway 26 behind the Still Creek Inn. It's our living history village, logging camp. Kind of restored everything. We have a chow hall.
Okay, so if it was at the falls.
Trading post, delivery stable, blacksmith shop. It's really interesting.
Wonder whose bed that was under.
Only open certain weekends.
Just say fake rock, but it's not a fake rock.
Like us on Facebook. That's
The real
the
rock?
best way to keep up with us and find out what's going on. Thank you very much for coming down and allowing us to share this part of Portland's history with you. Please remember the sidewalk has not moved in the time you've been down here, so watch your head exiting the underground. Also, the flashlight box will now be on the left as you exit the underground. Please don't forget to leave your flashlights. Thank you once again. You've been a very wonderful group. Thank you.
Kids, step away from there. County trials. Also.
How much of a tip you need? Oh, grab something so I can read.
There you go.
Get the heck out of here.
Set her up
Hi, Claire.
human
All right, well, we're leaving here. Hi, Claire. This to be my new Hey, go hang out. Hang out in the bunk bed.
People pay money for that.
Yeah, there's the pot for the bar. That's the pot.
Nice, yeah. Next second.
Yeah.
The official way to put the flashlight you're telling the ghost. I feel like I can tell him that that was premature. Really shows how
I really appreciate it. Way around a storeroom back there.
But wait, there's more.
I didn't grab the flashlight. I figured all of you have it. This is what you get.
What sauce?
I feel like Sylvia would like this tour. I know. Thank you. I'm going to traffic my wife.
Alrighty, thanks for coming.
Thank you, it was great.
Example of what earthquake roofing does, covers up all that beautiful heritage. So we put up those makeshift racks and hung artifacts from them to try and cover up that dull gray concrete. So this is very much what it was like for those guys in those holding cells. If you turn off your flashlights. So this is what it was like. They kept these guys in the dark. They didn't let them know what was happening to them. They didn't tell them what time it was, what day it was, what week, nothing. They kept them in limbo. So how would you feel waking up into a situation like that? Not very pleasant, especially after waking up off a bad drunk. So You're probably wondering why these guys weren't yelling and screaming, pounding on the floorboards for help. We can hear the businesses up above when it's busy. Surely they can hear us down here when it's busy. Well, there was always more Shanghaiers than there were Shanghaied men. They'd simply come down here and beat you into submission. One of our volunteers, quite a few years ago now, was digging around over in this corner looking for artifacts. He dug up a set of brass knuckles. So these guys were pretty brutal. They meant business, and you didn't want to be messing around with them. Also, as I mentioned, these guys made a lot of money. They spread it around. When the businesses up above are paid off, they're paid not to hear you. Nobody sees or hears anything. If you were fortunate, you had a holding cell that had a window with bars in it like this, so you can get your face by it, get a little bit of fresh air. As you'll notice, there's no airflow down here. Also, you were fortunate if you had a ledge built into the wall, either that or a chair or a wooden crate to put your chamber pot that you used as a latrine on, either that or a bucket. As you can well imagine, waking up in the dark off a bad drunk, somebody was bound to knock that thing over if it was on the ground, make a miserable situation that much more unpleasant. Now what they would do, once they threw you in a holding cell, they would spread a thick carpet of broken glass around the outside of the holding cell. They'd make you take your boots off first and throw them outside the holding cell. That's because they found out these guys that were early day longshoremen, big beefy loggers, cowboy sheep herders, wore heavy duty work boots, easy to kick their way out of those holding cells. So if you still managed to kick your way out of those holding cells in your bare feet, you wouldn't be difficult to find because you'd be the one limping and trailing blood as you went. This is a small piece of glass. We found larger pieces down here, but this is a good example. I found this when I was cleaning up down here one day after a tour. So imagine a whole carpet of this stuff along the outside of your holding cell. You didn't want to be trying to escape. So Michael's been working with a lot of incredible people over the years. One of the folks he ran across in his research in the underground was a gentleman by the name of Big Ears Kelly. Nobody names their kid Big Ears, do they?
That's our middle name, okay?
All right, so anyway, that was his street name. His real name, Melbourne Gibson. Now, Michael's not too sure if he was a Shanghaier in his younger days, but in his twilight years, in his late 80s, early 90s, he was helping Michael track down a lot of the folks that were involved in Shanghaiing and white slavery, getting them those first, second, and third-hand interviews, collecting documents and photographs. And one day he called Michael up, actually it was an evening. One night he called Michael up, he was so excited, he could barely talk. When Michael finally got him calmed down enough, he told Michael, he said, you know, I just got off the phone with a good friend of mine. I've known this guy for over 30 years, always been a straight-up character, never told me any tall tales or lies. And only just this evening, after all these years, did he finally admit to me that when he was a young man, he was a logger. He and his buddies had been paid. They came into the town, into the old North End. They were drinking in a saloon, and they got Shanghai. He said when the Shanghaiers threw them in the holding cell, they made them take their boots off and throw them outside the cell. He said, we think that those boots are still down there. You got to get down there with a shovel and start digging around in this one section of the underground. Well, Michael asked him when it was that he last saw those boots. And Big Ear said, look, I've never seen those boots. You just got to get down there and start digging around. So in 1973, Michael came down here and started digging. And if you turn on your flashlights and turn around, this is what he found. I'm going to go scooting through the crowd here if I might. Excuse me there, sweetie. Thank you. All right, everybody come down this way. And upside down picture. These are boots. Now these are cork boots or spike boots. Some of them, they didn't just Shanghai loggers, but they Shanghaied all different kinds of blue-collar workers. Now there's a cork boot or a spike boot. There's another one there. Spikes are pretty much worn out of them. So you have to imagine, the guys that were wearing these boots were gone for 3 to 6 years. That's because a voyage lasted for 3 years. Once the voyage was over, it didn't matter where in the world you were, they'd throw you off the ship if they didn't have another voyage lined up once that one was over. They didn't want to pay to take care of you. So we've heard of people ending up in Australia, France, just all over the world. Now some of these guys worked in those countries till they could earn enough money to gain passage back to the States. There's some folks that just ended up settling into those countries. There was some guys that stowed away, some hired on as able-bodied sailors since they had 3 years of experience. There was a group of guys, however, that couldn't come back, and that's because if they announced that they were having long pork or long pig for dinner, that meant they were having human flesh. Cannibalism was alive and well on the high seas. As we all know, these old sailing ships depended on the wind to carry them from port to port. The wind doesn't always blow even out at sea, so if these ships didn't make landfall before they ran out of food, your status on board that ship was below that of the rats. The rats actually had more status than you did, so you'd be the first one eaten, not the rats. So if there was more than one Shanghaied man on board that ship, they'd draw straws to see who would be the first one eaten for dinner. So you didn't want to be Shanghaied. How did you prevent yourself from being Shanghaied? Well, you stayed out of the old North End. You stayed out of the gambling dens, bordellos, saloons, because there was plenty of easy victims for these guys in those days. And you wanted to stay out of the clutches of these land sharks. Now these boots are going to haunt some of you folks. We've had people calling us back months later saying, I'm still having nightmares about these boots. If you're one of these people, you truly understand the brutality behind this practice. This is not a romantic story, folks. This is human abuse at its worst. Now, this is a photograph of where Michael dug those boots out of the ground, very same post right there. They'd still be lying in the dirt where Michael dug them up. Back in the 1970s, if it wasn't for people breaking into the underground and stealing artifacts, we've had a real problem with that in the past, as you'll learn later on in the tour. So we have to lock them up in this crate, haul them out of here at night. It's a real hassle, but it has to be done. And people who steal from archaeological sites, and not just this one, but archaeological sites all over the world, they're not just stealing from this generation, they're stealing from future generations as well. So, as I mentioned, that wall over there is a good example of earthquake proofing, but that wall in particular is where our paranormal folks seem to think that there is a portal that the spirits use to enter our world and exit back into theirs again. This is where we get people that are touched the most. Where this lady is standing by the ropes and cans right here, there was a young woman standing there many years ago. She had her back to the boots. She was looking at the artifacts on the wall. Very crowded tour. Michael was talking about the holding cells as I was a minute ago. So she felt a gentle pushing from behind her on her back. So she thought she might be standing on somebody's toes. So she stepped forward and to the side a little bit. Well, a few seconds later, that pushing sensation came back. Only this time it was enough that she actually had to brace herself to keep from losing her balance and tumbling forward. So when she turned around to confront whoever it was that was pushing her from behind, the only thing she saw were those boots. Now over here, right about over there, was where a woman was standing a few years ago. She said she felt it was like a hand reached up out of the ground, grabbed her ankle, started tugging down on it. Right here, next to this post, there was a young man leaning against that post while Michael was talking about the boots during a tour. His girlfriend was standing right next to him. All of a sudden, his shirt got pulled out from behind, so his girlfriend smoothed his shirt out. Well, it got pulled out once again, so his girlfriend smoothed it out one more time. After that, his shirt just started going in and out and in and out, all by itself. So this is where we have a lot of interesting things happen. This is where our paranormal groups will come down and ask questions. They'll leave their recorders going, and this is where they get answers to their questions the most. So pretty interesting section. The whole underground is very active, but this is one of the more active ones. So take one last look at these boots, maybe enough to earn yourselves a few new nightmares, and we're going to go over here. You don't want nightmares?
She pulled my hair. I thought she walked away.
of those. But,
Okay, if you're done taking a look, come on down here. We got room over here to my right. Make room for everybody. So, this is what's called a crib room. It's not a new term that was coined by druggies or gangsters. It was a term that was coined back in the 1920s when Prohibition was enacted. You couldn't legally possess, consume, or produce alcohol any longer. So it lasted up until the early 30s, I believe. Well, that put a lot of saloons out of business here in the old North End, but it didn't put Lazlo's out of business. You were walking down the sidewalk, looked in the window of Lazlo's. Back in those days, you saw a sign that said soda pop inside. That meant there was a speakeasy in the basement. You knew the code word, you could get down in the basement and drink alcohol illegally. Michael knows that there was a speakeasy down here. It was in that section over there against the far wall where the display cases are today. So while you could always make plenty of money selling alcohol, the real money, well, that was in prostitution. But now they had a little bit of a problem. The girls were a floor or two above, the guys were in the basement drinking. Now how do you bring the two together? Well, the ever inventive and ingenious guys that these individuals were, they simply brought a bed down here, made it nice and cozy, put a woman in it as a form of advertisement. When a line started to form from the speakeasy next door, one of the guys, like the bartender, would come over, say, gentlemen, no need to wait your turn in line. Plenty more ladies waiting for your pleasure up above, and away they would go. So again, that's all this was, a very simple form of advertisement. We weren't sure if this is exactly where they had a crib room set up. We didn't have any place else to put it. So we brought our archaeologist in. He started digging around with some volunteers. We actually dug up pieces of women's clothing and broken perfume bottles, so we're pretty sure this is exactly where they used to have a crib room set up. This is where we get a little bit of paranormal activity as well. You get reports of people seeing shadows of folks going across that sand every once in a while, so when nobody's there, of course. So that's all this was, a very simple form of advertisement. And Michael learned through his research that they didn't refer to these women as prostitutes or hookers as much as they referred to them as the ladies of negotiable affection. You have to remember, it was the Victorian age, and so very prim and proper. Puts a nice spin on it, though, doesn't it? So, take a good look, a few photographs, and follow me down to the stair ladder to nowhere.
Is that where we came from?
No, I thought we came from the. We came from
So normal.
I was thinking the same thing.
I'm kind of messed up
Yeah,
here.
and then you like come in. This is negotiable affection. Negotiable affection? Is it negotiable affection?
Yeah.
Is that what it was called? Yeah.
Wow.
Once you're done taking a look, come on
Might have to
down.
use that line.
Got plenty of room over to my right here. Well, that wasn't too bad. I didn't think so. The curator's a little worried about kids under 12 seeing that.
Ever seen a picture of Roseburg? Turn century? The air pollution is so bad.
Okay, looks like we got most everybody.
Really?
Alrighty, if you want to come down this way, we got room over to my left. So this is what we call our stair ladder to nowhere. We call it that because you'll notice it doesn't really go up anywhere, does it? Well, it wasn't meant to go up. It was actually meant to go down. As I mentioned, up in the courtyard, multiple layers of basements, up to 5. So when the contractor came down here to do the earthquake proofing, first thing he did was take soundings of the ground to see how solid it was, so he'd know how to engineer the walls for structural integrity. From those soundings, he found that there are probably at least 2 more levels of basements below us. Now, we haven't been able to find our way in yet. We're still looking. We think maybe hobos covered up one of the entrances when they put their walk-in freezer in, up by the trapdoor where we entered the underground. But we are still looking. Eventually, we will make our way in. And when we do, if it's still safe to bring people down there for tours, we will clean them up and open them up for tours. But we are still looking. Now, when they tore down the old hotel to make way for Pioneer Courthouse many years ago, they found 5 levels of basements underneath that hotel. Now, out here at Highway 405 in Everett, the Meyer and Frank building used to stand there. The building's still there, but they sold out to Macy's. Macy's did a renovation project. One of our tours guides has a friend who was an engineer on that project. He called her up one day, said, "You got to get over here. There's 4 levels of basements. I can sneak you in on your lunch hour." So she went over there, actually got to go down through those 4 levels of basements. Now in June, I had a young lady on my tour, and she told me that she worked there temporarily not long after they opened up that building. She said if you get to know the window display guys and sweet talk them, they'll actually get you down into those lower levels and you can still tour around down there. So, maybe something to do someday when you don't have anything else to do. I'd certainly like to go there. Anyway, there was another group that utilized the underground, more notorious and despicable than the Shanghaiers. Those were the white slavers. A little misunderstanding about what white slavery really meant. Some people think it was guys going out kidnapping white women and forcing them into prostitution. But that's not really what it was. It was white guys going out kidnapping women of all races, nationalities, and colors and forcing them into prostitution. Especially the minorities, because in those days the minorities had no rights whatsoever. So they're the ones who were victimized the most. Now they had a little more of a problem with these ladies. It was the Victorian age. Women didn't go into the saloons, men only. So they weren't easy victims. They weren't drunk, they weren't drugged up. But we did have a lot of dance halls and restaurants in this section of town back then. So the white slavers would go into those establishments incognito. They would befriend these women, lure them out into a dark section of an alleyway or a street for a romantic interlude. Their associates would always be waiting in the shadows. When the time was right, they would leap forward, grab that woman, drag her down into the underground, force her into what was little more than a 3x5 double timber walled closet so a woman couldn't kick or beat her way out. 1 woman to a cell. Now these guys had plenty of company. They had food and water. They had a chamber pot or a bucket for a latrine, and they always had a chance to come back, most of them. These women, they weren't so fortunate. They had none of the above, and they absolutely never, ever had a chance to come back. They died in prostitution wherever they ended up. So the whole object was to break that woman's spirit, and by that I mean to convince that woman that the only safe way out of that situation was to place her life in the very hands of the guys that put her in there in the first place. Now, it was psychological as well as physical torture. Probably shouldn't have to explain to most of you what it meant to a young lady of the Victorian age when at the end of that physical abuse they said, "You might as well give up now. You're ruined. Your way of life as you know it is gone forever. You're going to be working for us from now on." So Michael heard it took 24 to 48 hours to break a woman's spirit. Once that was accomplished, she was taken down to the waterfront, put on board a ship, sent to other cities. Other white slavers would send their women to us. That way they wouldn't have a support system. So if you think white slavery's ended, think about human trafficking. Still a real problem here in the States, especially here in Portland. We've been rated number 1, 2, and 3, depending on who you listen to, for human trafficking in the nation because we're on the I-5 corridor between Canada and Mexico. So we work with a few groups that are trying to bring awareness to it, prevent it. We have flyers out there on your way out. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about it, maybe helping prevent it, educate your kids on it, that would be a pretty good idea. So feel free to take one of our flyers on your way out. Well, In the early 1970s, Al Zarnato brought Michael down here, showed him what he called a white slave cell. In those days, it was in pretty good condition. But when we came down here 20 years later to start cleaning up this part of the underground for tours, it was in pretty bad shape. Holes had been punched through it to put pipe through. The wood had rotted away in places. So Michael had it dismantled, took it off site, salvaged what original wood he could out of it. When he brought it back, he put the original wood on the interior. The newer like wood is on the exterior. He says it's one of the eerier displays that we have down here. It's done some very interesting things over the years. He says the doors opened and closed on him so many times it doesn't even faze him anymore. Once he got to the door, he was about an inch from the handle to open it. It opened all the way by itself, closed all the way by itself. Well, I'm going to go down here. I'm going to open up this door so you can take a look inside, see what it was like for these women. If that door closes on you before you have a chance to get to it, you have my permission to open it back up again. However, we found most people, at least over the age of 6 or 7, don't have the nerve. You gotta love kids, they have no fear. Right, honey? No fear?
No fear.
Okay. There, you heard it? You heard it first. There you go. Alrighty, so follow me to the left. A lot of crawdads in the Willamette. Probably still there, but they're probably glowed and have 3 eyes. Okay, you got just about everybody now? Okay, so this is what's left of a tunnel. All of the tunnels were sealed off in late 1941. Anybody remember what happened in late 1941? World War II. The bombing of Pearl Harbor effectively ended Shanghai. It was a matter of supply and demand. Most of these guys were being conscripted into the military or joining voluntarily. So Shanghai lasted for 91 years. Wouldn't have lasted as long as it did if it didn't take place in the darkness and shadows of the underground, out of sight of the good citizens up above. Supposedly, what you don't see doesn't happen. Well, kind of like what a lot of governments think today. So this was later turned into a coal chute. You can see the coal springs down in the bottom corners. Here, when the coal furnace was obsolete, they ripped it out, they sealed off the coal chute. You can still see the plywood forms where they poured the concrete for that. This is a good example of the brickwork that the Chinese laborers did. They worked under the supervision of the European stonemasons that did all of the stonework. We had a family take our tour not long after we opened them up for tours a little over 20 years ago. This family was from Malala to the southeast of us. They took Michael aside after the tour up on the sidewalk and they said that their great-grandfather actually helped build this section of the underground. They later came back with documents and photographs as proof. So they also said that their great-grandfather's cousin was trained as a stonemason in London, England as well. They came across the Atlantic to Canada, down into the United States, across the Oregon Trail to Oregon City, and up to this section to build this part of the underground in 1885. Well, it turns out their cousin decided he wasn't making enough money as a stonemason. So he decided to join the Shanghaiers and became a Shanghaier himself. Well, one night he made a mistake no other Shanghaier ever made. he decided to go for a walk down by the waterfront alone without his bodyguards late at night. Now these guys never went anywhere without their bodyguards. So as he's strolling along the waterfront late that night, he runs across a group of guys that recognized him as the guy that shanghaied them many years before. So they beat him up, took him for a swim lesson that he never returned from. They found him floating face down in the Columbia Smooth the next day. So if you want to take a walk down by the river late some night, don't go alone. Instead, take a friend down by the west end of the Morrison Street Bridge. That's the site of the old Snug Harbor Saloon, later known as the Doll and Penny Card Room, that was torn down in 1985 to make way for the Bank of America building that stands there today. They say if you go down there around midnight, listen very carefully, try to ignore the sounds of the traffic on the bridge, you can still hear the sounds of men crying for help. Why are they crying for help? Turns out a ship had pulled into port in the 1870s. A couple of sailors got off, hadn't had a drink in months. They were headed straight for the Snug Harbor Saloon. They were a few steps from the front door, and they looked down at the sidewalk. They saw a trap door, much like the one we came down through this evening. The thing was open. At the base of the stair ladder, there was a barrel. They said, wow, barrel of whiskey. Nobody's around. Free booze. Let's go down and check it out. Well, they got down there. They found not 1 but 10. So they decided they couldn't drink all that booze themselves, so they started inviting everybody walking by that trap door down into the underground for a drink. Pretty soon they had a whole crew of guys down there just chugging away. Well, a few hours later, along comes a guy by the name of Joseph Bunko Kelly, also known as Shanghai Kelly, or simply Bunko. He was run out of San Francisco by the other Shanghaiers. He was so notorious and successful they couldn't compete with him. So he came north to Portland, plied his trade here. He was known as being a real opportunist, as never passing up an opportunity for a greasy buck. That's his image on the wall over there. It's an artist rendering. So he came walking by that very same trap door a few hours after these guys had discovered it. He looked down as he went by. He saw all these guys passed out in the basement. He said, wow, easy money. So he goes down, he starts counting heads. When he got to 30, he froze. He said, hold on, something's very wrong here. Nobody's breathing. In fact, everybody was dead. So he looked around a little bit closer and he noticed they weren't really in the underground of the Snug Harbor Saloon. They were actually in the underground of the mortuary next door. These guys have been drinking embalming fluid. How did they not know that? Embalming fluid in those days was about 99% pure wood alcohol. It also had a little bit of arsenic and heavy metal in it, like mercury. These guys have been chugging this stuff for quite a while. They thought they were just drinking some very nasty tasting but powerful home brew. Wood alcohol will get you drunk, but it will tickle you if you drink too much. These guys were chugging for hours. Not one to pass up an opportunity. Bunko ran back up that stair ladder, closed those trap doors, came back later that night with his associates, hauled each and every one of those dead guys down to the waterfront and sold them to the sea captains. Not for the going price of $50 a head in that day's money, but for $55 by convincing those sea captains it took that much more effort to get these guys this dead drunk. Did they sell dead guys in those days? Actually happened all the time in Portland, Shanghai. They had to knock these guys out, not just to get them from the holding cells out to the ship, but these old sailing ships could take up to 24 hours to get down the Willamette and the Columbia and out to sea. These guys woke up before they got out to sea. They realized what was going on. And even if they couldn't swim, they'd be running for that rail and jumping overboard and trying to swim for land. They'd actually risk their lives because they might as well consider themselves dead for the next 3 to 6 years. So the opium drops that they gave these guys in their food and drink were so powerful, some of these guys simply didn't wake up once they got out past the bars. Sea captains always knew they might have 1 or 2 dead guys on board their ship. They figured that into their purchase price. They always had enough guys to man their ship for the voyage. The dead guys jumped over the rail for fish food. So we're going to go through this center tunnel. If I can sneak over here, I'll grab our remote. See some lights going on for you. Alrighty, so if I can get everybody back for just a second. This is where we hear the whistler the most is the person that whistles an old time tune. Michael said he heard it one evening after a tour. He spent about 30 minutes looking for wherever that was coming from, wasn't able to locate it. I've only heard it once. This is also where we hear babies crying on our tour when there are no babies on the tour. This is where we hear a woman humming a lullaby to a baby. Classical music experts have identified that tune as Brahms' Scottish lullaby. This is where I saw the shadow of a person go by me on the wall over here as I was turning out lights after a tour a few years ago. I thought I had a straggler back there. The tour had already exited through the hole in the wall. So I went back looking, couldn't find anybody. So when you came through that hole in the wall, you were still under Hobo's restaurant. We're under the kitchen right now. When we go through the center tunnel, we'll be in between buildings. And when we get through that far archway, we're going to be under another building entirely. That is the boiler room where I pointed out the Hotel California to you over on the corner. So please watch your head on this pipe. It's solid iron. It's not padded. It will put a dent in your forehead. Please don't go under that pipe. I know it's an easier way to get to the other side, but this pipe does turn up once it gets about halfway down that tunnel. We're going to go around the pipe and then eventually through there. So follow me, please.
Yeah, that's the walk right on through.
Yeah, that one gets me one person.
What is she, about 5 or something?
She's 7.
All right, so this is another good example of earthquake proofing. Covers up all that beautiful heritage. Used to be a tunnel entrance right here. Used to be a little alcove right there, and that ladder led straight up into the boiler room above us. So that's what earthquake proofing does. Covers up all that beautiful heritage. Over here, this wooden wall is made out of slab wood. They further sectioned off the underground with slab wood. Very cheap way to do that. Slab wood is just the first piece of wood they cut off a log at the mill. Back in those days, they didn't chip it up for fiberboard. They just threw it outside the entrance to the mill. They considered it trash wood. The rich folks would come along, cut it up, burn it for firewood. The poor people would gather it, and they built things with it. There are still houses standing in North Portland today that were built out of what was once considered trash wood. So that's how they further sectioned off the underground with cheap wooden walls. When Michael finishes writing his memoirs, the name Frank Hammond won't be forgotten. He refers to Frank as the gentleman logger. Frank was shanghaied out of Erickson's saloon, took up the entire city block, the next block over at Cooch and Third, where the Dixie Tavern stands today. Now, Frank wasn't completely knocked out by the knockout drop. He remembered exactly which tunnel he was hauled out through. He was one of the lucky ones that actually made it back many years later. He went out across the bar during a very bad storm, but he thought he was going to die. When he did get back many years later, he found out he had lost his family, his business, his property, his life savings. It completely destroyed his life. So he decided he was going to hunt these guys down. He wanted revenge. He was going to kill each and every one of them. Well, he found out they were a little too well protected, too well connected. He couldn't get at them. So when Michael tracked him down in his old age, many, many years later, he agreed to help Michael with his research of the underground. And he always told Michael, whenever you're looking for evidence of Shanghai, you have to look for broken chairs. Broken chairs? Why broken chairs? Well, broken chairs indicate a bar fight. And there were plenty of bar fights in the old North End. In fact, they didn't discourage those bar fights, they actually encouraged them. That's because there was always drunken losers. Drunken losers were thrown out into the back alley. Shanghaiers would always be waiting back there to scoop these guys up, throw them into a temporary holding cell. Later on at night, when the coast was clear, not so many people out to see what was going on, they spirit those guys out of that temporary holding cell down through a trapdoor into the underground and into a proper holding cell. So that set of black metal doors in the back alley back there that I pointed out to you before we came around the block, that's exactly what that set of black metal doors was used for. Then, once it was late at night, they'd close and lock those metal shutters in the back alley so the patrons of the hotel couldn't see what was going on in that dead-end back alley. Then they'd take those guys out, down through that trap door, into the 3 holding cells that we were standing in earlier. So later on, you guys are going to get a chance to put your fingers through the very same bars the Shanghai guys put their fingers through. Pretty eerie experience. I've only had to do it once. So when the women... Really? So anyway,
Well, why do it more than once?
why say it? Say something once, why say it twice? Anyway, the old talking head song. Anyway, when the women got pregnant, and the prostitutes did back in those days, no birth control, the woman and the baby was put up on the top floor of the hotel until the baby was old enough to either be sold or given away, and then the woman was left to die here in the old North End of prostitution. Again, they never had a chance to go home. So up until about 16 Christmas Eves ago, we used to have a Victorian rocking horse and baby carriage on display down here, but that Christmas Eve somebody broke into the underground, stole those 2 items, so naturally we don't have them anymore. All we have left is a photograph. One of our volunteers had the foresight to take a few photographs of those 2 items, so that's all we have left. Up until those 2 items disappeared, when a group finished in here, usually a woman, but sometimes a man, as they were exiting through that archway over there, they would take one last look at that rocking horse and baby carriage, and they'd notice a woman in a Victorian dress, kneeling by the baby carriage, crying, "Somebody, please, help me find my baby." They come into us saying there's a woman in distress back here. We come rushing back, and of course nobody would be here. Whoever since those 2 items have disappeared, we haven't seen that woman, but we've seen another woman. We call her the lady in white because she has shoulder-length blonde hair, full-length white ball gown, white shoes. She's been seen down here going from that far wall over there, clear across this section and through this archway during a tour. She's been seen up in Hobo's restaurant, the most. So I've had quite a few experiences down here. I had a female volunteer helping me turn on lights, getting set up and everything during a tour a few years ago. We were having a conversation. She was following a little bit behind me. I entered this section first. I bypassed that light and went over there to unlock the display. I noticed out of the corner of my eye there was a woman over on this side, over by that wall. She said something as she turned and walked through that archway. I thought it was my fellow volunteer. It was a very colorful blouse or dress, whatever she was wearing at the time, and my volunteer also had a very colorful sweater on. It was February, so it was kind of cold out like it is now. So I said, "What was that?" because I didn't hear what she said as she turned and went through that archway. Well, I never got an answer. So when I came back over and turned on this light, right then, my volunteer walked through that archway. And I said, "Are you sure you just weren't over there a minute ago?" She said, "No, that wasn't me." So I have to remember, anytime I come down here, even though I'm the only living person in the underground, I am never truly alone. So I'm going to go over here, if I can get everybody to kind of step back a little bit. So in order to get these guys from the above ground into the underground as quickly as possible, they had to get them as drunk as they could. So that was the whole object of the saloons back in those days. So they didn't want you leaving for any reason whatsoever. So in order to keep you there at the bar, they would hang towels from towel rings that were mounted about halfway down and the full length of the bar. At the base of the bar, they built a trough, usually out of tin, sometimes out of brass, but in the case of Jake's Crawfish House over here at 12th and Stark, it's made out of tile. They had water running through it. So if a guy had to relieve himself, he never had to go out back to the outhouse to do so. All he had to do was relieve himself right there at the bar and keep on chugging. Now you have to keep in mind, Victorian age, women didn't go into the saloons in those days. So women think that's pretty gross these days. Men like myself, not afraid to admit it, and that's convenience at its best. Just doesn't get any better than that, does it, guys? Well, the last one operating here in Portland, not 100 years ago, it was actually 1974. It was the Hoyt Hotel, the men's club under the Hoyt Hotel. The city shut them down in 1974, said it was a health hazard. I think it might have been. So once they had you good and drunk, usually it was a prostitute that lured you to a dark section of the saloon